Hello, evil minions. It is I, your mean and evil overlord. Okay, and it is Wednesday, April 22nd, and we are here for part 2 of our lesson on the 5 causes of the Spanish-American War. Had a great Zoom meeting with people earlier today, and just wanted to hurry up and get on with part 2. This one is going to be probably my favorite part of this lesson, so I'm just going to hop right on to it. All right, let's go. So we talked about the Cuban Revolution. We talked about all of the things that were going on in Cuba. Well, the U.S. newspapers were writing about this, and they were looking at this as an opportunity to profit, and they took full advantage of that opportunity. So what is yellow journalism? Let's ask that question. Yellow journalism is a slang term that we now use to talk about newspaper stories. Back then it was newspaper. Now it is, any kind of journalism, whether it's TV, websites, magazines, any kind of news service with deliberately sensationalized news events, invented stories even, or exaggerated facts. And I've put facts in quotation marks there because facts are what they are. But sometimes you can take a very small thing and kind of make it a big thing and still say, well, that is a fact, but how you present it sometimes can greatly exaggerate. And during this time, you had a couple of newspapers, in fact, newspapers all over the country, that were sensationalizing events. And when I say sensationalizing, I mean they were making, as I said, a something that wasn't maybe that big and blowing it up to make it seem like it was the most terrible thing in the world. And we're going to see examples of yellow journalism pretty much throughout the rest of this unit as different events that occur are reported in the newspapers. They are, in many instances, greatly exaggerated, greatly kind of blown up to be something that maybe it wasn't. And why do they do this? Plain and simple. Back then it was to sell newspapers. The bigger the headline, the more terrible the news was, the more people were going to probably be apt to stop and glance at the headline and go, oh, I'll pay a nickel to read this story. And so papers went with these exaggerated news stories to sell more papers. It was more profit for them. Profit. Yep, that is a newspaper guy back in the day. Not really, but that's what they were looking like. Money, money, money was what they were trying to do. So they would make the biggest stories possible, the biggest headlines possible to get you, the reader, the newspaper buyer, to be interested in the newspaper. Because if you didn't buy it, they didn't sell it. If they didn't sell it, they didn't get the money for it. So they really wanted you to buy that paper. All right. So that, in a nutshell, is yellow journalism. Now, the two biggest newspapers pretty much in the country at this time, certainly on the East Coast, was the New York World, located in New York City, and another competing New York City newspaper called the New York Journal. Now, the New York Journal was published by a man named Joseph Pulitzer. He went on with a lot of the money that he made during this time to fund what we now call the Pulitzer Prize. And there's a number of different categories of the Pulitzer Prize, but this was the man who started it all, and he made his money by publishing the New York Journal. His main competitor in the New York World was a man named William Randolph Hearst. And those two men were fighting for dominance in the newspaper game in New York City. Not many people were necessarily going to buy both issues of the paper. Some would, but not everybody would. and people started picking their favorites. So these two papers were really competing for a limited amount of newspaper money in New York City. Now, the reason it's called yellow journalism really goes back to this weird little kid here, if you can see that. Back at the time, there was a comic strip called Hogan's Alley, and I've seen a couple of the Hogan's Alley comic strips. They don't seem all that funny to me, so they're probably more political cartoon than actual comic strip. What the kid you see there was called the Yellow Kid, and that was kind of his dress, his garb, what he wore. But back then in the 1890s, when this was happening, yellow and orange dyes were used as part of color for comics, and these dyes would run. If you've ever tried to make a tie-dye T-shirt, or maybe you've used magic markers and then on a piece of paper and then got it wet, you could see how that ink kind of spread out. This would happen frequently in these newspapers back in the day, and it would leave these papers with this yellowish tinge to it, this yellow appearance. And so it got to be to the point where you would see one of these newspapers, you'd kind of roll your eyes and go, okay, I wonder what crazy story they're going to have today, what kind of yellow journalism we're going to deal with. And that's how that term came about, allegedly, from what I've seen. And you can see here, these men, Joseph Pulitzer here and William Randolph Hearst here, they are fighting over what are, in essence, typesetting letters that would be used to do a newspaper back in the day. That's why that R there is reversed, because if you're using it kind of as a type block, you would ink that up and press it against the paper, and that would leave a regular looking R. So they're fighting over war. Who can report this war? Who can make this war bigger? And what war are we talking about? Well, that will become the Spanish-American War. All right? And so these men took events in Cuba, and we talked about that in part one of this lesson, what ultimately ended up being what's known as the Cuban Holocaust, and some of the atrocities that the butcher, Weyler, General Weyler was, as he was called, perpetrated upon the people of Cuba. And these two newspapers took these events, sometimes events that were not super terrible, but by the time they got done writing about it, it would sound like it was the worst thing that has ever happened to people. And we learned later that this Cuban Holocaust was pretty serious, but a lot of the things that they were writing about, and very often, were just not as bad as they maybe were in real life, at least as we understood it at the time. But they did it to increase their newspaper sales. And it created a newspaper war between these two men. And what they wanted to do was be the top newspaper in the city of New York, on the East Coast, and even in the country. And these men would basically, there was no story that they would tell that was too shameful for them to print. All right? Now, here are actual pictures of these men. This is William Randolph Hearst here, you can see, and Joseph Pulitzer. And the question we have is, was the Spanish-American War the first press-driven war? I think that answer, at least in the United States, is yes. There is a very good chance that the United States would never have entered into war with Spain, except that the influence that these newspapers started to have over the American people, when you pick up a newspaper and say, and read this headline or this story about, oh my God, this terrible thing is going on in Cuba, how can we let this go? People naturally believe it. They believe, okay, if it's in the newspaper, that must be a fact. And if this is really happening, this is a terrible thing. And so these newspapers began really to sway public opinion against Spain, and constantly urging the United States government to do something about these things. And that put enormous pressure on the United States government, because the United States government wasn't necessarily ready to go to war. The army was certainly not ready to go to war. It was a very small army at this point. Our Navy was pretty good, but our Army was not really prepared for a war. But because of the pressure raised by these two competing newspapers, by getting the American people all spun up about what was going on, they kind of forced the government's hand. And you can see here a little cartoon that was run at the time. And this, a week after the United States declared war on Spain, Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, very proud of himself, was like, "How do you like the Journal's war?" He was bragging about the fact that the Journal got this war started. And of course, you can see a newspaper cartoon at the time from obviously the competing New York World, depicting William Randolph Hearst as the Wizard of Oz, which is a play on the story The Wizard of Oz, which, yes, was a thing back then. So these men, again, were constantly competing with each other, and they essentially pushed the United States into war. And we'll talk more about that later in parts 3, 4, and 5 of this lesson. So did it work? If we look at the sales figures for the New York Journal during this time, in 1895, they sold roughly 30,000 newspapers a day. That's a pretty good amount. I believe that's per day. Morning journal sales. That's per day in 1895. Now, as the events in Cuba started unfolding, as these two newspapers started to compete, here you notice 2 years later, in 1897, the daily sales of that New York Journal had gone up, by a huge number. It went from 30,000 to 400,000 copies per day. That's a lot of newspapers. That's a lot of money. If you're William Randolph Hearst, if you're, one of these two men that we see here, Pulitzer or Hearst, and you see your sales go up this much, you are obviously thinking, hey, this yellow journalism thing works. Look at all the papers we're selling. Look at all the money that we're making. Let's keep it up. A year later, when the United States finally gets into war with Cuba, and we'll talk more about that later, the Journal is selling 1 million copies a day of their newspaper. All right. So did it work? For them, yes, absolutely it worked. All right. We will see more examples of yellow journalism again in the rest of this. When we get into part 3, we're going to talk about the Delome letter. The United States, these two newspapers had a huge thing to say about this Delome letter. And you'll see yellow journalism throughout the remaining 3 of these categories. But that is, in essence, what yellow journalism is. And we can draw comparisons between what's going on now and then. We and not necessarily with what we are currently dealing with, but just in general. When we talk about the news programs that we watch, or the adults in your life watch, when we talk about the websites that we go to for our news, the thing we always have to remember is that these news sources are providing this news service not as a free service to us necessarily. They are doing this to make money. And how these websites make money is through advertising. You see, every page that you click on, you'll see ads pop up. You will see banners along the bottom. You'll see things along the sides. Those are all ways that these newspapers online make money. So they're going to print these huge headlines that are going to make you want to click. And the more pages you click on their site, the more money they make. So it is in their interest to create headlines, to write stories that you're going to want to read, right? So they're not going to necessarily, and TV stations work the same way. These your local TV news programs work this way. Your national news programs, your CNN, we watch that all the time. For current events, that station, Fox News, MSNBC, any of these stations that you watch, they make their money from the commercials that play during their programs. So obviously they too have an interest in drawing you in and making you click. So you always have to look at a news program, at a news site on the internet, with kind of that doubting voice in the back of your head that says, let me analyze this. Is this just a news site trying to get me to click? Is this story true? Can I verify these facts elsewhere? And you really have to be a little skeptical on our news sites today. And I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm not saying that at all. But sometimes you just have to sit back and go, wow, did that really happen that way? Or is there a part of the story that they're leaving out? Is this, what is the motivation behind bringing that story? And you always have to remember that the motivation for bringing you that story very often is the profit of whatever news source is providing that information. So they want you to click. They want you to tune in. They want you to buy their magazine or their newspaper. All right? They want you reading their content because that's how they get paid. They want you watching, what they are providing. So you always have to, keep that in the back of your mind. When you are watching these news sources, they're trying to make money. All right? So with that, I'm going to sign off. We will get to part 3, which will be the DeLome letter next. And I will talk to you soon. Let me pop back up here and just say, I miss you. I wish we could do this in the classroom. And peace. If anyone has a hidden immunity idol and would like to play it, now would be the time to do so.